Good morning, everybody. It's very nice to see such a full house at the start of the day. And thank you so much, Jesse, for joining us this morning and giving us your time. I've got a set of questions here, but we're going to be fairly relaxed about this, and I know you're happy. We'll take some questions from the floor. We haven't practiced this, you realise, ladies and gentlemen, so we'll see how we go. But I want to give you lots of opportunity, Minister. Our conference today is about improving our productivity in relation to transport and roads in particular. What role do you think transport needs to play? Because I know government's got lots of ambitions in this way.
What a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me along today. Thank you, CIHT. Thank you, Matthew. Thank you, everyone. It is a fascinating moment to be in transport. When you said I'm going to give you plenty of opportunity, Ginny, I think what you meant was I'm going to give you plenty of opportunity to make a fool of yourself, and I'm very happy to do that. It's always a test of mine for an audience as to how well disciplined they are. That is to say, how many seconds it takes before they ask a question about Brexit. We're not going to do that, ideally, but we can, of course, in due course. Any question you have on any topic is of great interest to me. Let's start with productivity, as Ginny's mentioned. So productivity is a really important, interesting issue. As you know, it's a very important issue for the government. It's a very important issue for my department. It's not actually as straightforward to answer as you might think. There are many reasons why productivity has been dragging in the UK and why we are some way off, some way down the league tables when it comes to international measures of productivity. But the one thing we do know is that, there we go, it sounds better, is that transport is absolutely at the centre of improving productivity for the UK. Now, I don't need to take you back to the days of Adam Smith. You want to get a product to market. In order to be able to sell it, you have to have decent infrastructure. Infrastructure is essential to the functioning of markets. And so we're spending an enormous amount of time and money, frankly, your money, my money, on infrastructure of different kinds. Why are we doing that? Well, A, in order to improve the functioning of markets. B, in order to assist people in all the other things that they do when they're not thinking about business. And of course, C, to improve the way in which transport is itself delivered, the productivity of the transport and infrastructure process itself. What's the evidence for that? Well, in my area, if you look at it, RIS2, the second road investment strategy, we have £25 billion worth of envelope allocated towards that strategic road network. Also, the inauguration of the beginnings of our major road network. But sitting behind that, a lot of thinking about how you improve supply chains, how you get the most bang for your buck, and of course, productivity is above all the extraction of the maximum of output for the single pound of input that you put in. So all of that kind of fits together. There are plenty of other examples one could give in the autonomous vehicle area. We're spending quite a lot of money on that. We're spending quite a lot of money on electric vehicles to support that, all towards a future that's not just greener, but more productive.
Could I just check, I'm talking about autonomous vehicles and electric vehicles, all that field of future technology, some of which is actually here already. We don't have to wait too long for it, I think. Do you think there's a form of measure that we might be thinking about how do we think transport is going to be successful in productivity terms?
Well, there's a whole raft of questions concealed under that. People run electric vehicles and autonomous vehicles together. Actually, it's really important to keep them apart. They raise lots of different issues. Turns out human beings are terribly bad at predicting the genuine future. Uncertainty is an absolute everyday, it's a function part of our everyday lives. What we're quite good is extrapolating from bits we can see already. And we can see that lots of electric vehicles are already being deployed. We're thinking about the future of mobility. We've got a big review coming out, a big consultation coming out in due course in the next few weeks. And of course, it's terribly easy to get preoccupied with autonomy because that's the headline-grabbing issue. But actually, a vast amount of it has to do with micro-mobility. Electric scooters, electric skateboards, e-bikes, pedelecs, mopeds, all these really interesting intermediate vehicles that you can get. And of course, a lot of that is about improving productivity in the last mile. We've done a last mile review, and actually fascinating thing is that I think there's lots of evidence that if you think creatively about how the last mile of deliveries are made, you don't have to go down the traditional diesel delivery model. You can go down e-bikes, e-vehicles, and they're at least as productive as well as much greener.
Yeah. You've touched on that last mile aspect of the journey, which is very important for looking from perspective of those who look after local roads in particular. We've touched on the importance that government is focusing on around that last mile. What about the funding then for those local authorities that look after? We call them local roads, but after all, they're the vast majority of roads by length in this country.
By length.
By length, absolutely. What about the future of funding, for instance, for local roads?
Well, yeah, ladies and gentlemen, you will all know my official Steve Berry, and if you don't, he's standing over there
Yes,
looking rather handsome, and he can raise his hand. And I'm going to warm the cockles of Steve's heart by saying how seriously I take local roads. I think roads are really important. There's been a kind of mild sense in government over successive administrations going back a very long way that somehow local roads are not something that government as a whole ought to be taking interest in. You know, shut some money over to local authorities and leave them to do the job. And of course, we do expect local authorities to be responsible for local roads. But that doesn't mean to say they aren't an absolutely invaluable national asset that we ought to be thinking strategically about. Now, it's amazing to think that before 2014, we were not thinking in terms of our roads at any level on a long-term planned 5-year basis. Now we have RIS 1 for our strategic roads, we've got RIS 2 coming in, I've mentioned. We've got the beginnings of a 5-year planning process in terms of thinking about the strategic interrelationships that would constitute a major road network. That's very early stages, as you will know, but very much part of the picture. And one of my ambitions has been to try to take that thinking, 5-year funding, known in advance, transparent, inclusive, and apply it to local roads. Now, you know, the outcome of this in money terms is a function of the spending review, as you would appreciate, and rather than get decapitated, kneecapped and chopped into local ditch, I'm going to hold off on making prognostications about the spending review. But one thing you can say with absolute certainty is that I think the initiative is there to support local authorities that are treating their roads as assets, to which this kind of more strategic approach would naturally apply. And if you are, by any chance, I doubt if any members of the CIHT are doing this, but if there are any local authorities that aren't really thinking in that inclusive way, long-term way about their local roads as assets, then I would strongly encourage them to do that. And by the way, I don't just mean local roads, I also mean bridges and tunnels, which are important assets in their own right, and which to some extent have been neglected by government as part of the wider view that I've hinted at. I want all that to change. I've been perfectly clear about the need, from my point of view within government, to take local roads with the same degree of seriousness that we do the other parts of the road network. And I think, frankly, if we're ever going to get anything like an autonomous future, we've got to start quite seriously investing in roads from end to end, because, of course, those roads are going to have to bear autonomous vehicles wherever they are, you know, in the final analysis.
What about the roads fund then? This aspect of government funding that's been drawn together to focus for the strategic road network. Is this the answer for local roads as well? Do they get a share of that pot of money?
It's really important not to conflate the local road funding settlement with the VED-funded roads fund. And the reason for that is because we need a separate settlement for local roads, and RIS 2 is already very heavily under pressure, as you will know. It's a highly competitive process. Our infrastructure needs in this country are enormous. We are in the process of a huge program of future investment, and the case for local roads funding should be made in its own terms and properly. And I absolutely don't want local roads to become, as it were, the fag end of a VED-funded local national roads fund, which has already been established, set up, and funded for a very specific and separate purpose.
We touched on the future of mobility. I'll let the audience ask you some questions on those really interesting topics we've just covered, but I do want to touch on future of mobility report that I know the government's released about a month ago now. The headlines from that, a lot of it looks at transport from a much wider perspective, which we at CIHT very much support. What's your view on looking at transport in the future terms of that report, allowing for these different aspects? Are you a supporter of those very strong themes that CIHT have been pushing, thinking about health, thinking about transport in a much wider context?
I was definitely a supporter of health.
Yeah.
No, Ginny, I would say this. Look, the thing that was published a few weeks ago was a really interesting piece of work, a piece of semi-academic work by the Government Office of Science. That's not the same thing as what we're working on now in the department. The two go very well together. There's some really interesting discussions to be had between the two documents and the two ways of thinking. But we're thinking about a policy framework for the next 10, 15, 20 years in the way we think about future mobility. That's what our document's going to be about. Starting on urban areas, not because we think they're more important than rural areas, but because you've got to start somewhere. Technology naturally, historically, has tended to develop in cities. Although, of course, what's fascinating from a future mobility standpoint, from autonomy perspective, is the variety of use cases you get, not just inside cities, but outside. And in due course, we'll be following up with a future mobility rural strategy as well. And I hope we can use some of the lessons we get out of the urban, although there'll be a lot more that we'll learn as a result of doing the work on the rural side. As I've said, it'll touch on autonomy, but it'll also touch on a range of other things that fit into this wider picture. So if you do believe, as I very strongly believe, and as you've hinted, in the importance of health and well-being and environmental sustainability and all the other things that make a really happy, well-functioning society, then you've got to be talking about greener solutions to last-mile delivery. You've got to be talking about active travel. That's a really important part of things. When people forget that the rise of the car has been fantastically enabling for people, but it's destroyed active travel in many ways. People don't travel anything like as much by walking or cycling as they used to. And as an avid cyclist, I massively believe in the health and well-being benefits of cycling. There's a joy of arriving in any particular location on a massive endorphin kick because you've been pedaling there is just fantastic. So it's going to cover the whole gamut, although of course we'll be paying particular attention to, and it's going to set out a framework for thinking about these different trade-offs, although of course we'll be thinking heavily about autonomy, electrification, and of course micromobility. Yeah.
Just one round of questions before I let the audience have a go at you.
Sure.
What about linking this to planning and how we use our city space, our rural space? What's the future? As you see, we've talked about connected autonomous vehicles in terms of technical solutions. We've talked about funding, but actually how are we going to make the world of planning work with the world of transport in terms of the future?
Well, again, that's a fantastic question. Two or three different things. One is that as the Government Office of Science report looks at a world in which the markets are just allowed to do what they want without any form of constraint. And I think it's quite easy to see that you might get some really negative outcomes if you do that. At the same time, we certainly, listen, I spent a long time living and working in communist Eastern Europe. I know what it looks like when you have a state-dominated transport system. It's not very pretty. And it's also extremely environmentally bad. So what we're looking for is that happy medium where there's enough, as it were, constraint in terms of law and the suppression of economic externalities, pollution and the like, but at the same time, enough support for markets and enough liberal atmosphere in which apps and technology can really flourish to give us that kind of really attractive middle way. And that's the thing. Now, when it comes to government, I think we've got to be much cleverer about the way we have been. The way in which the planning system and, as it were, strategic thinking about the relationship between housing in particular and urban settlements, the businesses that go with them, and transport interlinked, I think has been historically very bad. It's been bad in many ways for good, honest reasons of private property and individual autonomy and community autonomy, but in a LinkedIn world, I think we've got to be much cleverer about how we manage that. And I think we get much better social outcomes for everyone if we do. I'm
going to come back to you with a few more questions after that we've let the audience have a go.
These guys may.
No, I'm definitely going to have control systems here. Can I ask you to invite you to ask questions of the Minister?
Mike Walter from Transportation Professional magazine. Minister, a huge amount of time and effort, of course, over the last 2 years has gone into Brexit, which will have, which
now,
will
I did ask him that. I was
30 seconds. I'm very impressed, really. You've held off a long time.
time. Well done.
I mean, naturally, a lot of domestic policy, including transport, will have taken a back seat because of what's been going on. What assurances can you give, Minister, that transport, infrastructure, and indeed future mobility will become more front and centre in terms of government policy going forwards?
Well, if I may say so, I think the question is completely wrong. I mean, I don't know if anyone's been paying any attention to what I've been doing in the Department for Transport, but we've had a cycling and walking safety review, we've had a last mile review, we've had a future of light rail consultation, we've had some work on cycling offences, we've got the future of mobility coming out, we've got the road to zero across government on decarbonisation and sustainable future. If anyone thinks that's anything other than very high tempo government, then you're sadly mistaken. So I don't actually think Brexit's made any difference at all to the actual practical effectiveness with which we've been able to deliver these results. And I massively take my hat off to my civil servants, Block Ria, Steve, for all the work that they've done on that, not to say, you know, managing the normal processes of funding and support for innumerable organisations and chunks of the transport economy. What's also interesting is that even where we have focused, even where we've been able to turn the dial up to 11, really focus on Brexit, it's had some positive results as well as some negative results. Very important to realise that. You know, we've significantly increased the resilience of transport in the southeast. We've made much greater connectivity, much greater mutual awareness about some of the ways in which the different departments of government need to interoperate in these circumstances. We've been very engaged in reaching out to other countries to supply layered transport links, so we're not simply reliant on a deal with the EU as part of the withdrawal agreement. We've got resilience in that mechanism as well. So I think there's been a lot of positive outcomes, and it's also frankly shown that the civil service can rise to the occasion, and our agencies, DVLA, DVSA, VCA, and the rest of them, can rise to the occasion when they have to. And I think that's been a very inspiring and rather attractive thing.
Minister, in terms of productivity, surely one of the most important things is halving or reducing the commuting time into major areas of employment within cities and coming into cities. But to that end, the DfT scrapped the local sustainable transport fund, despite its excellent evidence, has now removed transport from the large local majors, rolled it up into other areas where you're not guaranteed funding, and failed to address the wastage from competitive bidding. Isn't it true that the DfT, in terms of directing funding and allocating funding, has not been very productive?
So first of all, you raised a whole series of issues. Of course, I think a lot about how productive DfT is, and I've just made an argument to the gentleman there that actually we've been more productive because of the need to deliver our business as usual agenda, which isn't, of course, business as usual, it's the high energy new stuff alongside Brexit. In terms of large local majors, I don't think that's true at all. We're continuously announcing large local majors. I literally just announced 55 million quid to Worcester last week. We've got a bunch of stuff in the hopper there. I think if you look at there are issues that have to do with what the right balance is between high BCR, high benefit cost ratio projects, which you want to be able to deliver, some of which are smaller, and bigger strategic projects, which may not show big short-term gains, but which you think are really important for the national kind of arteries. A classic example, Lower Thames Crossing, a very important project for us. It's a long-term investment, a lot of money. I think that's going to have enormous benefits in the longer term in terms of productivity. I spent my life chasing, as you know, I used to be, you won't know this, but I used to teach philosophy in a previous life, and I've written a lot about economics and thought a lot about economics. I spent a lot of time arguing with my officials about the 5-case way in which they build up business cases for different scenarios, the interaction with the Green Book, whether we're really driving efficiency on that basis. And I mean, I wouldn't pretend that we're by any means perfect, but we're certainly the best in government at doing it.
I think just Dominic's point about cutting travel time into city centres or urban centres, and you'd mentioned your future of light rail consultation, and I noticed Ginny was involved in the maglev project at Birmingham Airport, so I just wondered if you could expand on the role of, you think of, kind of light rail or mass transit type systems in future mobility.
Sure. By the way, I absolutely agree about the importance of reducing commuting times, or at least maintaining them at a time where you're massively increasing capacity. I think that's absolutely right. I mean, people rightly point out, take a little example, that when Lloyd George was Prime Minister and Member of Parliament for the Carnarvon boroughs, it was quicker to go from North Wales to South Wales via London than to try the route directly. That might still be, well, wouldn't quite be true, but it almost would be. But the difference is that the amount of capacity is vastly increased. So you want different things from a transport system. In terms of the light rail approach we're doing, I would massively encourage anyone in Scotland is interested to look at this, and indeed I'm interested in the project you mentioned, to look at the light rail review that we've done, which looks at the full spectrum from, as it were, the bigger trams all the way down to much more individualized modes of transport. And I think it's a really interesting area. I'm absolutely interested in cities, city regions, areas around the country that might want to come together to think about what a small city light rail system of the future might look like. Potentially pool buying power. I'm in my wildest fantasies, I think, well, actually not my wildest fantasies, but almost my wildest fantasies, I think about having an aspect of the industrial strategy where we have a light rail production facility for next generation tram systems in this country. I think that would be, it's the kind of sad person I am. I think that would be really interesting. So I would encourage you to read that. We've had a terrific response so far, and again, talk to officials if you'd like.
Minister, you've made mention on several occasions in the discussion so far about the economic importance of transport investment. But of course, we have a very large housing crisis in the country, and that's something which is recognised, I think, across government. Incidentally, it's actually one of the things which is very, very easy to engage ministers and MPs in discussion on, because it's a huge relief to get away from Brexit, I'm no doubt, but it's also actually an incredibly important topic. To what extent in the business case planning for transport investment are you taking account of the ability of that investment to help deliver more housing?
We are doing a lot of work to try to join up, to close any gaps that might exist with regard to housing. As you will appreciate, it's often the case that you get a kind of suspended animation or instead of the virtuous circle, the vicious circle, where people can't plan housing until they've got an idea of where the transportation links are going to be, and vice versa. As you probably know, in Essex, there's a serious problem at the moment with planning on the A12 because Colchester Council basically decided that they wanted to do housing in different models. We're still waiting for them to tell us where they want to go. And we're trying to reach forward as much as we can. We can't spend public money building roads to nowhere, and there are plenty of countries around the world, including in Eastern Europe, where they've done that on the basis of an official diktat, and it wasn't a particularly clever thing to do. But you have to iterate very closely. And one of the things I think is quite interesting is the way in which Highways England have got better with us at thinking about how those long-term investments are to be structured. And again, that's one of the beneficent outcomes of a more long-term approach. You can say, well, we're going to be funding this thing, roads at this level for the next 15 years. We are going to need to take account of what housing developments look like, and therefore we can have a more structured and hopefully intelligent conversation about it.
I'm going to refer to Brexit again, I'm afraid, but in several ways. First of all, productivity, going abroad. I'm very concerned about the companies that are leaving Britain. What can we do about that, and what are you expecting? But I'd also like to ask you about the legislation and the kind of protective legislation we've got for air quality and standards for vehicles. How are we going to be able to protect our society and our environment, assuming Brexit actually happens? And finally, you mentioned resilience in the southeast. Isn't that going to be a bit ridiculous if Brexit happens, and what are you expecting there?
The trouble with Brexit, I have discovered, is that what you think of it has really often got very little to do with the particular information or data available at the time. It's really about your worldview. I mean, is this a glass that's half full, or is it a glass that's half empty? Is this a world which is half full, or is it a world that's half empty? And the cases you raise, I think, perfectly illustrate this. So the focus that people have had when they thought about loss of manufacturing has been on cars. Well, I've looked into this very closely. I used to be the Department for Business, Energy, Industrial Strategy, thought very hard about it. There is no doubt that the last announcement that was put out about BMW clearly reflected a concern about Brexit. There's also no doubt that the Honda decision had virtually nothing to do with Brexit. It had to do with the free trade agreement that's been struck between EU and Japan, which reduces the value of local production. It has to do with the lack of scale in their business in some respects. It's also true that the Nissan decision had virtually nothing to do with it. It had to do with diesel, above all, and the desire to move rapidly to electrification. So there are different, and by the way, I could tell you stories about Boeing making its first international investment outside the US in the UK. I could tell you stories about Facebook and Apple and many businesses of the future setting up and increasing investment in this country. So it's a mixed picture. And people who think, who forget the resilience of and the dynamism of the British economy, I think make a serious mistake. In terms of the wider picture, I've already talked about the southeast. Listen, we are prepared for some pretty severe disruption. Again, please do not confuse that with Brexit. We had severe disruption in 2015 as a result of French strikes and the inability of stuff to get across. That was a very protracted period of transport disruption, which would be very significantly mitigated if it happened again today, whether the cause of it was Brexit or not. So actually, I think there's a lot of good that's come out of the situation as well.
Sorry,
There was a third question which I've
Yes,
forgotten, which I'm happy to do if you remind me what it is.
Impacts, air quality, was it?
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, air quality,
Impacts,
yeah. So, well, listen, I don't think if you were a councillor in Derby or Leeds or Southampton or Manchester or Birmingham, you would be thinking for a second that we took air quality lightly in Department for Transport, because we are focusing very, very hard on that question. We're thinking very hard about how to enable local authorities to take local mitigations and other measures, and frankly, we're funneling a lot of money in to support the process, 450 odd million quid. So it's we will naturally find, as society develops, that our standards, and rightly so, go up. We want them to go up, right? We want to live in a happier, healthier, more diverse and culturally invigorated society. So naturally, our air quality, which dropped off a cliff because of incautiousness about the effects of diesel and other things in the past, will be starting to rise up, and it's right that we should continue to raise standards. We're not taking it remotely lightly, I can tell you that.
Jesse, I'm really heartened with what you said about a sustainable funding strategy for local roads, and we sort of want to support you in the quest. So, a bit of a plug.
Right to the Chancellor.
That we're doing a review. CIHT doing a review.
Oh yes, I know you are. Yes, good.
Yeah. So we want to help you in your Star Chamber session with Treasury to give you better evidence for your quest. And one of the things that we want to raise is, we need more money, but also we want to make sure that money gets to where it's needed and is spent effectively. So we want to sort of raise issues about the governance arrangements in terms of how local roads operate, and just really wanted to make you aware of that, and just wondered what your thoughts were about how that might be improved.
There are some aspects of what you might call an inclusive local road asset strategy, which have tended to be the poor relations. Bridges and tunnels are a classic example of that. And there's been a wider problem in government generally, which is that politicians have tended to want shiny new extensions rather than high quality, proper, long-term maintenance. You saw we made a big announcement yesterday about potholes. Listen, it's terribly easy to be panicking about potholes, but we are doing so much work in that area, it's not even funny. Tons of technology, tons of road surface assessment, tons of pothole spotter trials, tons of work on street works and coordination of utilities and longer-term guarantees, and there's a vast amount of work in that area. So I take that, and I've told you that I take this issue, and I hope you can see I take this issue extremely seriously. I really look forward to the report that you're doing. I think it'll be really interesting. I share your view, and the hint I made earlier about local authorities is, I personally, and I'm not speaking for official advice on this at all, but I would like us to be funneling whatever money we are able to get into areas where they have shown this proactive, forward-leaning way of thinking about all of these assets as something to be preserved, enhanced, and maintained, enhanced for the future. And if there are local authorities that aren't perhaps putting their best foot forward with regard to incentive funding at the moment, then I can see a possibility that incentive funding, we don't want to leave people behind, but we absolutely want to set the incentive to play ball and to treat this thing with the seriousness it deserves. And I think that's pretty widely shared view. And I don't think it would be responsible, from our point of view, from a taxpayer standpoint, to put money into explicitly long-term strategic asset-based strategies if the local support wasn't there and the local leadership wasn't there.
Minister, I just wonder if you could say how you think we're doing on road safety as a country, and then what the future areas of focus are going to be for the department.
I didn't even mention it when I was describing the work that we've done in the last few months, but we've done a lot of work on road safety as well. And I announced that we would, first of all, as you know, we did quite a lot of work on cycle and pedestrian safety as part of the review there, 50-odd actions coming out of that. I'd love to do more. We're trying to put our foot down as hard as we can in that area. As you know, the general problem in road safety is that the number of killed and seriously injured people kind of leveled out a few years ago, and it's been very hard to make any impact on that. And before one thinks this is a specifically UK problem, it's been very hard in Sweden to do that. I mean, it's just a general problem, and it's moved from being one where some of the low-hanging fruit of road safety improvements have been garnered to a situation where you have multiple factors and a rapidly changing social context which seems to be affecting how road safety works. We're taking that very seriously. As part of that, I have announced a refresh of our road safety strategy. We'll be publishing that, in the next few weeks. And I would expect, I think the bureaucratic phrase is shortly, in the spring, and spring being something that was infinitely elastic. And we will be focusing on 4 areas in particular there. So part of it is a kind of the both ends of the bell curve, but also both ends of the life cycle. Sort of young drivers, people driving for the first time, very early stages, which is a very high-risk group, older drivers, and the threats that they may pose to themselves and to others because of all the usual problems associated with baby boomers coming into that higher risk area, and then rural roads and motorcyclists. And we're trying to make progress on all of those areas. I can tell you, it's very detailed, careful work that's required. And as you would have detected from my style, I'm less interested in the big headline-grabbing initiatives than I am in the things that actually make a difference. And if some of them are big headline-grabbing, that's great, but it's the making the difference that really matters. And I hope you'll see a pretty serious document when it comes out.
I've probably spent virtually all my career worrying about road safety on and off in various ways, and I suppose I've often been challenged, Minister, about the success or not of adopting policies. How do you think you'll measure the success of your four-pronged attack here?
Well, I think it's extraordinarily difficult. Part of the problem here is that because it's multifactorial and complex, it's very hard to know what counts as success. Listen, if the numbers fell from nearly 1,800 people killed a year to 1,500 people killed a year, I think we could say without any doubt at all that whatever we'd done, we didn't know why, has been successful. I think it's very important to be humble about that. I would struggle to take any credit if we had that effect. But by the same token, the heroism in it, in a way, lies in the fact that you don't know in advance that interventions are going to be successful, and you nevertheless have to try to keep being as careful as you can about how you intervene and to what purpose.
Do you just give yourself an amount of time? Do you think in 6 months' time, if those policies aren't driving changes, we should do something different, or is your strategy going to look out?
Let me ask you a question then. So
I knew this was going to happen.
No, but that's great, Ginny. So let me ask you a question. What is the one road safety policy you would most like us to introduce? If you were, imagine you are temporarily, we've suddenly got the electoral system right, you are the UK benevolent dictator, what's the policy you introduce?
I suggested to a colleague who I won't name, who I think is sitting out there, that you just ban all men from driving until I think statistically it's 36, isn't it? But
I'm assuming I think what you mean is you want lots of female chauffeurs. I don't think I agree with that approach at all.
But that's far too flippant for what is, as we all know, an incredibly serious topic.
Listen, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but it is an area in which you spent 30 years working.
Yes, I think you're absolutely right. I think the reality is to ask people about what their honest opinion is about how they would behave differently. It's not about a policy about, driver guidelines or the condition of vehicles. It's about all of these things, but most of all, it's about us individually, isn't it?
Okay.
About us being honest about actually what we would do differently as individuals. I don't know what your view on that is.
You've done that. You're even more adept than I am as a politician at not answering the question.
You can tell I've worked in
Ginny.
government for a long while.
Highly impressed. I spent my life idiotically trying to answer the question. You've done brilliantly. No, I would say this. Say your policy of banning men from driving.
Well, yes,
No.
I shouldn't have said that.
But hold on a second. Paul, you can't have it both ways. Let's just say that was the policy. What period of time would be the appropriate period of time to judge whether that was successful or not?
I don't know. Interestingly, because I'd say academically, you'd probably look 10 years ahead. But I know that if I was sitting with somebody who lost a relative or, was a teacher trying to teach 6-year-olds a sense of road safety, when they're crossing the road or something, and you can't wait 10 years, can you? So I think the reality is you've got to say what happens in the next year. Has the response, can you measure the response of what your philosophy is?
Listen, I sit very regularly and have extraordinarily emotional conversations with mothers and fathers who've lost their children in different kinds of road safety accident. Okay, so I do this. This is part of my professional life. It's part of my job. And there's nothing that can compensate for the loss of a child. And to lose a child in such a futile and tragic way is even worse. But it is also true that, for the reasons you've hinted at, you cannot make good policy on a short-term basis. Let me give you an example. We've just been working on tyre safety, aging tyres. Now, there was a dreadful case, as you will know, a few years ago, in which a young man was killed in a coach accident because one of the front tyres was very old, 19 years old, and blew out on the A3. And the coach hit a tree. And the family, the mother of the boy, has waged a campaign ever since, to her everlasting credit, to try to change the situation. And government, actually, to its credit, has done exactly what we would want it to do, which is it has tried progressively to make change that would accommodate the concern. So first it banned the use of older tyres from the front wheels of front axles of coaches. That has enormously reduced the infringement rates, now under 1%. I'm sure lots of lives have been saved as a result of that. Then when I took over the brief, we were able to up the tempo of that. We then moved to bringing in DVSA, greater DVSA monitoring and enforcement. That's had further effects. Now we're moving to a ban, but not just a ban having commissioned research for the first time, requiring the gathering of tyres in a cohort, sending them to America to be analysed. This is cutting edge stuff. And we have moved now to a situation in which we are going to consult on banning tyres, not just on coaches and heavy goods vehicles, which is what the original campaign was about, but on minibuses and potentially private hire vehicles and even conceivably cars. This is tyres over 20 years old. Now that measured, proportionate approach will always be criticised by everyone. It will be too slow for some, it will be too fast for others. But actually, it did, I think, something that was rather honourable. It didn't, as it were, it didn't change immediately in advance of the facts. It tried to move proportionately. It addressed the initial ill quite effectively and quickly, and then it's moved with reasonable speed in the last year or so to an outcome that I think will be very socially beneficial. So I don't think we can measure road safety outcomes. I don't think there are many magic panaceas that don't involve drastic human freedom invading, life undermining, productivity destroying interventions. I don't think we can move that quickly. I think we've got to temper your academic interest in a 10-year proposition with the grieving family's 1-year interest in an immediate solution to get something that works broadly for everyone, and we'll end up getting criticised by all. The academics will hate the simplistic short-termism of it, and the family will denounce the outrageously immoral delay, but I think we'll get somewhere sensible in due course.
I'm a transport planning apprentice from Capita. My name's Erin. And I'm just curious, being from Newcastle, what exactly your plans are to connect the real north, because I'm well aware that you are focused a lot in Manchester and want to try and bring business to Manchester. But I feel as though you ignore the real north, Newcastle. There's not a lot of connectivity there. We struggle to get to places such as Birmingham. I was there for a conference in Birmingham, and it took me around 4 hours to get to Birmingham, and it's just ridiculous. So I want to know, as an MP, what your movements are to connect the real north to the rest of the country and not just focus all the money and the ideas to the south and Midlands.
You did that clever thing of segueing between the real north, which you take to be Newcastle, and the north. I'm not going to comment on the distinction that you draw between those two. If you were in Manchester, you would be saying exactly the same thing with a degree of indignation about the south, etc. As you know, in the case of Manchester, we have, under the Transforming Cities Fund, Newcastle obviously has benefited as well, we have funneled £250 million into Manchester. What I like about that is 160 million of it's going on a cycling and walking strategy being led by Chris Boardman with the Mayor and Brian Deegan on the infrastructure side. That's incredibly interesting from our point of view, potentially path setting in this area. Now, when you get to Newcastle, we've taken it incredibly seriously. I mean, we wrote a cheque for £450 million to support the improvements to the metro. We've created the first A1M1 motorway status road, quality road, all the way there for the first time in history. We've invested a lot in some of the specific blockages north on the road up towards Berwick-on-Tweed. We have a borderland strategy which is being imposed, and that's before you get to 10 billion a year of rail improvements, a large chunk of which is going into Northern Powerhouse Rail. So again, it's part of the problem. These things take 5 to 10 years to plan and implement, but more money is going into that part of the world, however you define it, than I think has done for a very long time, and certainly under different governments, or possibly governments of an opposite stripe.
I'm going to have to stop us there because, Jesse, you've given us a lot of your time. Thank you very much, and covered a lot of subjects. Can I ask our audience to thank you very much for taking all the questions?